The International Monetary Fund has upgraded the country's economic growth forecast for 2025 to 3.9%, a 0.5 percentage point increase from its earlier projection. The fund attributed the improved outlook to stronger macroeconomic stability, rising investor confidence, and increased oil output. The upward revision is in the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook report presented at the ongoing World Bank-IMF annual meetings in Washington, D.C. There is even a brighter projection for 2026 to further strengthen to 4.2%, reflecting a 0.9 percentage point improvement from its previous forecast. The revision reflects reduced domestic uncertainty and Nigeria's limited exposure to the new tariffs imposed by the United States, which have had minimal impact due to the country's modest trade links with the U.S. According to IMF, the Nigerian economy has shown notable resilience in recent months. The exchange rate has appreciated and investor sentiment has strengthened since July. For more on this, we're joined on the line from Calgary, Canada by Professor Magnus Kpakol. He is a former Chief Economic Advisor to former President Obasanjo and National Coordinator of the National Poverty Alleviation Program. Thank you, Mr. Kpakol, for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Constance. Very happy to join you and my brother Benga there. So happy to be talking to you this morning.
Nice to have you.
All right. Good to see you. So let's start with the first question. I'd like you to give me your assessment of the latest World Bank report on Nigeria and also the IMF prescription that Nigeria must improve good governance in order to increase borrowing costs or reduce borrowing costs rather.
Okay, well thank you, Dr. Constance. Well, first of all, let me just say that I think that the economy is stabilizing. There's no doubt about that because we see financial stability, we see macroeconomic stability. So we have to give kudos to the administration, for the wonderful job they have done to be able to get things stabilized. So what we want to see now is growth, from where we are, and we want to see significant growth. Now, you talk about the World Bank report. I suppose you're talking about where they said that we might see poverty numbers in about near 139 million people. I suppose that's what you're talking about. I don't think that that's too misplaced. I saw that the government quarreled with it a little bit. But in the face of it, of the difficulties, the challenges that people have faced over the last year or so, it is not surprising that you see a poverty rate that has climbed to about 139 million people. So that's probably not I mean, it's a problem, but it's not something to be disputed. We do have a serious degree of poverty in the country. I mean, I was just in the country and I could see. But that does not take away from what I just said that the government is doing, stabilizing the situation. So what we want to see now is to rev up income growth. We want to create jobs and go forward from there. As I just said, we have what you could call external balance. That is, on the surface of it, we see a balance in the balance of payment situation. Our exports and imports are in tandem. There's no real crisis in that regard. And we see financial stability, as I said. The foreign exchange market is good. The Naira has stabilized quite incredibly, very impressively. And that's why investors are coming in. But we don't know what's happening on the employment side. I think we're still having difficulty with what I would call internal balance. So we are not sure what's happening with jobs. I think that we still have a lot of work to do there because we need to increase our productiveness. And that's where Nigeria and much of Africa has suffered for many, many years. The reason why you have the low GDP per capita that we have today of well under $1,000. I mean, there was a time, I think around 2014 or so, when we were looking at GDP per capita numbers around $3,000. And now we're talking $800 and something, $807. I mean, that's just really very un-Nigerian to see those kinds of numbers. But I suppose that as we begin to rev things up, as we begin to produce more, we get people to produce, that we could do well. The problem is, how do we produce? That's what the challenge is. I'm not sure that as a country, we have got a good handle on how to rev up productiveness or to increase productivity. It has been a real challenge to us. And I think that we'll have to do something innovative, something extraordinary to be able to do that. I don't want to use this occasion to promote my book, but I just wrote a book on how to use endowments all across Africa to stimulate economic growth. And I think that that's been the problem, that people are in a way disconnected with the endowments that they have in their communities. And I argue that if you allow people to be better connected with their endowments and you support communities to be more productive, that's how we create jobs. I think that sometimes the government becomes too arrogant, especially the federal government. And it's not just this federal government. The federal government of Nigeria has, for a long time, in my view, been too arrogant in thinking that they can do it all, when I know that they cannot. And not I know, we all know that they cannot. And they have to get to the point where they begin to involve communities. They begin to involve, get state and local governments to participate more. There are ways of sitting down to make sure that that happens, but it's not going to happen until we have strong human capital development.
Professor Kpakol, let me come in here. Yeah. Let me come in here. Thank you so much for that starting point. We have been having the prescriptions from the Bretton Woods institutions for decades in this country, and so same in some other African countries. Do you think those prescriptions consider the political and social realities of a country like Nigeria? Because we have all of this, but it hasn't been translating to what people expect from the government. As an economist, what's actually happening here?
Well, I say this all the time. I am not aware of any economy in the world that has boomed because of IMF and World Bank policies. As a matter of fact, I did my doctoral dissertation many centuries ago on IMF conditionality, and I continue to follow the IMF and World Bank prescriptions and activities across the world. I don't think that we as a country should surrender to IMF and World Bank strategies. I think that we should listen to them. We are part of the global economy, and so we have to be a part of the global marketplace. But we should be able to design and implement our own strategies by ourselves, because we should be able to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps with a little bit of assistance, from them if that is necessary. The countries in the world that have been very successful, if you go to Singapore, you go to Korea, China, and all these other countries, they design their own place, where it's the IMF, that took them over the line. So I don't think that we should, and oftentimes in Nigeria, I hear people say the World Bank said this, the IMF said that, and it just kind of, it surprises me that we keep saying that. We have people that can say things for ourselves. We can make our own forecast. We can design our own strategies if we come together. But as I said, the federal government by itself cannot do it. We need the state and local governments to be empowered, and we can empower ourselves. We really don't want to, we don't have to go too far off to go learn how to produce goods and services. We've got endowments. You've got oil, you got gold, you got minerals, you got the ocean right there outside the Niger Delta area in Lagos. You've got all kinds of resources all over the place. All we need to do is to translate those resources into goods and services that the people of the world want. That's what human capital development is about. There is no country in the world that has been successful without developing their human capital. Now, we don't seem to pay much attention to that. Human capital development is not about going to the university and getting all kinds of degrees. It's about being productive, being able to take knowledge. Matter of fact, to me, I define it as that your stock of knowledge and of your wellness and of the skills, especially leadership skills, behavioral skills, attitudinal skills, emotional skills that you need to use to produce goods and services. If you cannot produce goods and services, then you don't have human capital. You don't have human capital just because you have a degree. You have human capital because you can produce stuff. Capital is that good that is produced to be used to produce other goods and services. As I said, the number one antidote to poverty is capital. It starts with human capital. When you have the human capital, then you can produce the other kinds of capital, like physical capital and financial capital, and so on and so forth. That's where we have lacked. That's where we've been lagging behind. Our leaders have to become leaders. They continue to want to become politicians, and that doesn't help us much. So I respect our politicians when they are leaders and not politicians. When you're leaders, a leader usually has an objective.
Hello, Professor
Usually,
Kpakol.
yes,
You just allow me to come in here. The
please.
IMF, now I'm bringing you back to the IMF report, is raising an alarm bells, a very important warning on revenue leakages in Nigeria. And it says that this is linked to illicit financial flows that comes from stolen funds, proceeds from criminal activities, and also untraceable digital transactions, which is eroding governance and crippling development activities. So how would you advise the federal government to go about these revenue leakages that the IMF has pointed out?
Well, as I said, the IMF does not need to point out anything to us. We already know it. We know that one of the real serious challenges that we have is that of poor governance. You may call it leakages. The fact that we are not very efficient with the management of our resources. So we have to try to do that. We got to be able to watch that. And I think that's an area that the president has to pay a little bit more attention to be sure that we're a little bit more efficient in the use of our resources. I mean, you got resources, but you got allocative efficiency, you got economic efficiency. So the whole matter of efficiency means that we use the things that we have for the purposes that we want, and precisely for those. But we don't tend to do that. I mean, I was just in the country, and almost everywhere you go, I mean, you see signs that we're not quite that committed, to that objective. All the countries of the world that are successful, they are very disciplined. They're very efficient in the things that they do, and that's why they are successful. I mean, if you see any professional in any kind of field, you'll find that one of the things that characterizes them is efficiency, then is speed. So we got to be able to have speed, and we have to have efficiency in the things that we're doing. We are not doing that.
Professor
We're not able.
Kpakol, for the sake of
Yes.
clarity, now in the last review of the World Bank report in Nigeria, there seems to be a policy gap from governance to the people. And that's
Yeah.
talking about the gap between the macroeconomic stability reforms coming from the macroeconomic stability coming from the government reforms and real-time microeconomic realities. That's the ability to put food on the table of Nigerians and people, the average Nigerian on the streets. So how do we bridge this gap?
Yeah, well, I agree with you there and they are correct when they say that. There is a real gap between the macroeconomic numbers that we put out there. You know that you say the GDP growth rate is 4.2%. Doesn't mean a darn thing to somebody in my village in Godi land, in Beder, to be precise. If it does not translate to a higher income to that person. So you got to make sure that that happens. And I'm saying the only way that's going to happen is if these guys are productive, if they have goods and services that they are providing to the world, especially if they're exporting those goods and services. If you look at a country like South Korea, in 1970, we had a GDP per capita that was almost 2 times that of South Korea. Today, theirs is almost 43 times ours. The reason is because they developed their human capital and they're able to produce more goods and services. That's why you see Kia, Hyundai, Samsung, all these different products that you see out there. We don't see our own products because we don't know how to accumulate capital, to use capital in the production of goods and services. If you can't do that, it won't happen. You can have a GDP per capita of 4.2%, but if personal income is not growing, it's not going to help. The reason why you see people crying much is not because you remove subsidy. It's not because of some of the things that have happened. It's because their incomes are not rising. So when you have a situation where inflation continues to be high. I know it is trending down, but prices are still rising. That's why you have that 20% inflation rate. It means prices are going up by 20%, not as much as before, which is a great improvement. I really commend that. But it is still high on top of the one of the year before and the year before and the year before. So the cost of living is pretty high, but there's no income growth. Well, there ain't going to be no income growth if we're not producing goods and services. And I'm saying that the way to do that is for communities to look at their endowments and for the government to encourage them. If you have oil, that oil, in my opinion, should be owned fully by the communities that have the oil, full ownership. And then what you do is the government taxes them. You can tax as much as 80%. The government will get more revenue than they're getting now from that activity. If you have gold, the same thing happens. You allow them produce. If you have land, the same thing happens. If you're close to the ocean, you go out into the blue economy and you utilize that. You've got to produce goods and services. That's how you're going to close that gap between what you see in the macroeconomy and what you see in people's households.
All right. Professor Kpakol, I'd like you to reflect quickly on your time in government and help us to understand what you learned during that period, because there is a difference between being in government and being outside government, and it's easy to criticize. However, those who have been there will say it's more complicated. Tell us, or what can you share with us from what you've learned and how we can use that?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Constance. Well, personally, I don't like to criticize. I mean, as I said, if you notice, I already commended this administration for what they have done. But we also have to suggest to them areas where they can do better. And if I reflect on the time that I was in government, actually, I was surprised by the fact that government was not as I said, as efficacious as I thought. They were not as poignant as I thought when I was on the outside. And I realized some of the weaknesses of government. The government cannot create jobs per se. The government cannot produce goods and services per se. And that's what I mean by the arrogance of government. And so there is this tendency for the government to think that they can, and they convey that impression to the people, and so the people believe that they can when they cannot. It is the people that will produce the goods and services. And I want the governments to understand that and recognize that. There is an issue that is on the ground right now with the conditional cash transfer, which many of you know. I introduced the conditional cash transfer into Nigeria. I designed the conditional cash transfer the way we have been implemented in Nigeria. Somehow we have sort of deviated from the way I designed it, and I see there's some challenge right now with that. I mention that because we need to work it from the bottom up. There are some people who argue that we should take the money that we want to use for conditional cash transfer and put it only into entrepreneurship. But that would be bad in a sense, because there should be no society should try to run a system of survival of the fittest. If you're somehow weak in society, then we leave you behind. When we let you perish. We cannot do that. We have to, in fact, the cost of our progress is the poverty that we see. Imagine if we take this 139 million people that we talked about and we make them into productive people. You can imagine how big our economy would be. You can imagine much more how more products we can produce. So it is always important to me that we try to bring everybody along and we give them capacity to be able to produce the goods and services that the people of the world want.
Okay.
So it asks me what has been my reflection when I look at when I was in government.
Professor Kpakol, we're pressed for time. I wish we could go on and on because we're making a very huge sense in terms of the human capital development and the need for government to focus on productivity. I'm sure we'll invite you some other time to further expatiate on these points. Thank you very much for making our time to be part of Daybreak on Arise News. And that's all we have time for here on Daybreak. It's goodbye from me, Benga Ashuru.
Please do keep it here on Arise News. The morning show is next. I'm Constance Ikoku. Goodbye.